Chapter 18. Life in Bombay. We arrived at our new home on Malabar Hill by horse-drawn carriage, climbed a long flight of concrete stairs, and entered through a huge wooden door into a large apartment. My sister Dolly, who was 2 years older than myself, and whom we called Dolly because of her big round eyes, cherubic lips, and button nose, and my brother Farooq, 2 years younger than myself, ran through the empty rooms with me and heard our excited voices bouncing off the walls of the large empty flat. We found a balcony that faced the street, and we stood there looking out at some tall trees across the street, which almost hid a large building behind them. I later learned that it was Government House, but at first I thought it was the Parsi burial place, which was actually a little further away. Perhaps the source of my misconception were Qayyum's stories that spurred my imagination. Qayyum had probably waved his hand vaguely in that direction to indicate somewhere close by, and I became sure that the Tower of Silence was there, behind the trees, a tall, circular, hollow structure with metallic rods crisscrossing the top and opening out at the bottom to the sea. Qayyum was the young boy with a clean-shaven head who came to work for us and whose main job was to help Yasin in the kitchen, but who preferred telling us stories. Here, high on the griddle, we were told by Qayyum that the dead bodies of the Parsis lay open to the sky and were temptingly placed for the brooding vultures that sat satiated in the trees or flapped their gigantic wings as they swooped hungrily down on the naked carcasses. He also told us that Parsi children had to take part in a ceremony when they were about 10 years old, and that a string was tied around their waists, after which they were made to drink the urine of a bull. Encouraged by his attentive audience, he went on to give us more sensational information, telling us that Jews also had a strange way of burying their dead. He said they turned blue when they died and were dressed up in their best clothes and then put on roller skates and wheeled to the cemetery at midnight. It was fortunate that once I fell asleep, I slept soundly through the night, for any sound on the street at night would have triggered my imagination to visualize a suited and booted corpse being roller skated down the street. For a simple 10-year-old boy who had moved to Bombay from a poor rural village and had never had any formal education, Qayyum's knowledge of the rituals of different religions was not so far off. But as with all those who attempt to belittle other people's beliefs, he only told us that which was sensational, and also only that aspect which would shock us. This gave him a certain sense of superiority about his own faith, of which he didn't know too much, and also made him feel very knowledgeable in the face of our ignorance. The Parsis, who do practice a form of Zoroastrianism, have an initiation ceremony where young boys and girls are made to drink taro, the urine of a bull, but he didn't tell us, or most likely didn't know, that Zarathustra was a Persian prophet whose doctrine about monotheism was probably the root of Judaic and Islamic monotheism. He also didn't know that many other concepts such as heaven and hell, the fight between good and evil, the concept of angels and one God, and praying 5 times a day were also part of Zoroastrianism. The Jewish ritual for burial that he told us about was a creative and imaginative way of explaining an early Jewish practice of burying the body upright, and was instituted to economize on the usage of land. Qayyum also told us stories about Sheikh Jilli, a fictitious simpleton around whom innumerable stories were spun in India. These tales amused and fascinated us, so we listened with rapt attention. The one I remember most of all was the story about how Sheikh Chili's mother told him to go and visit his uncle, and that if his uncle asked him what he had eaten that day, he was to say, Dal bhat bharra. So he walked along, and to make sure he didn't forget, he kept repeating, Dal bhat bharra, Dal bhat bharra. Well, Sheikh Chili was very forgetful and rather simple, but he did remember that his mother had said to walk straight to his uncle's house, so he kept walking in a straight line. This meant that when he saw a large puddle of water in front of him, he kept walking directly through the puddle. The water was cold, and he said, "Oh, oh," which meant that he stopped repeating the words, and he realized as he was wading through the water that he had forgotten exactly what he was supposed to tell his uncle. Just then, boom! He passed wind, and the smell immediately reminded him about what he had eaten, causing him to instantly recall the exact words he was supposed to tell his uncle. So saying, Dal bhat bharra, Dal bhat bharra, he continued on his way. At this, to Qayyum's delight, we would be rolling on the floor with laughter. Another story Qayyum related to us regarding Sheikh Chili was about the time he had been told that he would die if a piece of red thread was found on him. And it so happened that one day Sheikh Chili visited a friend who happened to be a tailor. When he arrived at the shop, his friend was busy cutting up fabric and stitching a new garment for one of his clients. The tailor wasn't very well organized, and lying about the store were bits of scrap fabric and, of course, little bits of thread of various colors. When Sheikh Chili left the store, he was horrified to see a small piece of red thread sticking to his pant leg. He immediately got into a panic and shouted out loudly, "I am dead! I am dead!" No amount of persuasion could convince him that he wasn't dead. He insisted that they bury him. So the people, knowing that he would not give them any peace of mind unless they did as he said, decided to do so. They did this, however, by leaving a small opening on the top of the grave through which he could be fed. And while we were wondering about how this could be accomplished, Qayyum launched into another episode and said that this time Sheikh Chili had befriended a thief into stealing for him and was persuaded one night to get some money that lay hidden under the bed of a rich man in the town. Sheikh Chili very obligingly attempted to do so as he was told. He climbed into the house through an open window of an upstairs bedroom, while the thief held a ladder in place for him. The man was quite obese, and Sheikh Chili could see the contour of his belly rising and falling with each loud snore that he emitted from his gaping mouth. Sheikh Chili became very concerned at the condition of the man. He thought that the guttural sound of each snore was the man saying, "Pani, pani," water, water. He imagined that the man was dying of thirst and was begging for water with every breath he took. Sheikh Chili ran into the kitchen and, grabbing a kettle of water, ran back to the man with it and quickly started pouring water into the man's open mouth. The man jumped up in fright and spluttered in rage, shouting, "Chor, chor! Thief, thief!" The entire household awoke and also started calling out, "Chor, chor!" The whole neighborhood woke up and called out, "Chor, chor!" Not only did they nab Sheikh Chili, but also the thief, who had been waiting at the bottom of the ladder and had tried to escape when he heard the halla gulla. But they caught him and locked him up when it was discovered that he had been a nuisance in the neighborhood, robbing people for a long time. But they released Sheikh Chili because they realized that he was simple yet kind and was instrumental in helping them catch the thief, so he was left free to continue with his adventures. Chapter 19. Beside our apartment was a short alley branching off from the road, which ended against the cliff of hanging gardens, and across the alley was a low 2-story building where a group of dhobis lived. On one occasion we heard a lot of loud singing and clapping, and we wondered what was going on inside. Qayyum, who besides being our storyteller was also our main source of news, he informed us that there was a wedding in progress, which would last for several days, and he said that Dhobis celebrated by getting drunk and singing loudly, using a lot of swear words. I didn't blame them, considering they had to regularly wash other people's dirty laundry. Our apartment was on the top floor and overlooked the Dhobis' building, which was lower than ours and also lower than another building beyond theirs. We occasionally wandered over to the further building and met an older couple who lived in one of the other apartments there. They were probably Indian Christians, though unlike other converts at the time, the wife did not wear dresses but wore a sari, and I picture her now in the dark blue cotton sari with a black and red border that she was wearing the last time I saw her. She was slightly shorter than her husband, who was of medium height, and she gave the impression of being round because of the way the folds of the sari draped across her well-endowed front and over her shoulder. They were both dark-skinned, probably of South Indian descent, and had threads of white interspersing their black hair, which to us meant they were very old, and we were taken aback at how demonstratively affectionate they were with each other, doing the unusual thing of holding hands when they walked down the street. They didn't seem to have any children and always smiled at us if we wandered into their building to play with other children, the wife once offering us candy, saying, "Here, take 2 toffee." We referred to them as 2 toffee after that, and for a lark would hold up 2 fingers at each other and say 2 toffee in very sober, deep voices, and then giggle in that silly way children have of finding absurd things to amuse themselves. Above this couple lived another family. We rarely saw the mother, but we often saw the child, a young boy who would hang over the balcony and watch the events of the day unfold on the street below. My mother was concerned about the precarious position of the child and cautioned the woman, but each afternoon we would still see the child continue to take up his position on the balcony, till that fateful day when he tumbled over the railings and crashed to his death on the street below. We heard later that the mother didn't rush down to her child because her husband was not home and she could not step out of the house without a meher. When I heard the adults discuss the incident, I imagined that a meher was some kind of clothing or a pair of shoes, and didn't know why her husband had to be home for her to have them on. It was finally explained to me that a meher, according to Sharia law, derived from the hadith, is a man who is either the husband or a male relative whom the woman is not permitted to be married to, and who must accompany a woman whenever she steps out of her home to go anywhere. On the ground floor of our building lived a lady with very scant hair, and we rudely called her Ganji, or bald woman. Our laundry used to be hung out to dry on the veranda, and one day an undershirt of one of my brothers or my father's flew off the balustrade and landed in the alley. We called out, "Ganji gir gayi," meaning the Ganji fell down, wickedly punning on the word Ganji because Ganji in Gujarati meant either undershirt or bald woman. In the apartment adjacent to ours lived a lady who was a classical singer, and we often heard her practicing her ragas, singing the notes in varying ways. She would stretch out the note sa and hold it for what seemed an interminable length of time. Her voice didn't waver or quiver, but hung in the air like a fine thread held taut, extending, then fading into infinity. Unbeknown to us, we were learning about music by osmosis, and this was perhaps why we developed our own interest in singing, even though it was mostly English songs. The first song I ever learnt was, "It was on the Isle of Capri that I found her, beneath the shade of an old walnut tree." Having no clue what "she wore a plain golden ring on her finger" meant. And I also learned, I like you very much. I think you're grand. Why is it when I feel your touch? My heart starts to beat a band. I love the tune and the stutter-like repetition of the first words. I also did learn my first Hindi song, which, not understanding the words of Hindi songs either, I sang as Sawan ki nazare hai, which is nonsensical, instead of Sawan ki nazare hai. In other words, it is the beautiful time of spring. Chapter 20. The veranda was on the side of the building where one entered the apartment, and immediately to the right was a bathroom. A friend of the family from Burma, Yakub Surma, regularly visited us, and much to our amusement, always made this his first stop as he came in through the entrance door. He was still a bachelor at the time, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, of medium height and build, with a pleasant disposition and unremarkable features. One April Fool's Day, when we knew he would be visiting us in the evening, Eunice, Raffia, and Arthur strung up a bucket full of water over the entrance door in such a way that the moment Yakub Surma came in and the door opened, the bucket tipped forward and emptied itself all over him. He was completely soaked, to our delighted squeals of laughter and his utter embarrassment and annoyance. The street in front of our apartment was generally quiet, but now and then we would see interesting things, like the plump lady dressed in a sari with her bare midriff exposed, revealing double rolls of fat. She would come by selling onions and potatoes, which she carried in a large basket balanced on her head. She would call out loudly in a high-pitched nasal tone, "Kanda batatiye! Kanda batatiye!" Occasionally, we would also see little children begging on our street, their undernourished, spindly arms or legs distorted out of shape so that they became completely disabled. We were told that the children had been deliberately mutilated by the parents, relatives, or abductors to elicit sympathy and alms. This unscrupulous and cruel business enterprise is not unknown in India even today, the perpetrators usually picking up orphan children or paying poverty-stricken parents to buy their offspring with a promise to give them a better life. Each area of Bombay that I passed through in my daily life seemed to have a distinct odor associated with it. The entrance to our building was from the alley off the street and had a heavy, almost damp, musty smell which contrasted sharply with the pink honeysuckle just beyond it, which scented the steps leading up to hanging gardens. The garden itself had flowers and sculptured hedgerows, freshly mown lawns misted with water sprays, euphoria fuming the air. We sometimes encountered a man carrying a tray of hot roasted chickpeas, calling out, "Channa chora garam, channa chora garam," which he sold to us in small paper cones. Somewhere in the gardens, above the cliff face, were frangipani trees, and their blossoms often floated down onto our balcony like blessings, delighting us with their simple form and heady fragrance. Behind the apartment building, and within a few feet of the rear wall, was the vertical drop of the cliff face of Hanging Gardens. If you reached out from the toilet windows, you could probably have touched the rocky surface of the cliff. In the crevices and the hollows, birds nested, including a rock eagle owl that sat ensconced in a cleft on the cliff face. I could feel its presence behind me, the black center of its large yellow circular eyes boring through my back as it watched me when I sat on my haunches doing my business in the Indian-style bathroom at the back of the flat. Qayyum told us that if we caught the owl and starved it and then beat it, it would start talking in Gujarati and tell us where there was a lot of gold and money hidden. Yasin overheard this and berated him for filling our heads with nonsense and said that it was not true but an evil superstition and that we as Muslims should not believe this for a moment. Strangely enough, the cultural connotations attached to owls in different parts of the world vary so much that, for instance, in the West, the owl is considered to be wise, while in the subcontinent of Asia, to refer to a person as an owl or ullu is to insult him, because the word is synonymous with stupid. At the far end of the apartment and also backing onto the cliff face of Hanging Gardens was the kitchen, where Yasin the cook made pink and white batasha, sugar cookies made with melted sugar, which he removed from the stove just before it caramelized, as treats for us. Another tidbit we enjoyed was sucking on baraf ka gola, which was a ball of crushed ice with a rose-scented red syrup poured over it, which we bought from the street vendor who had a huge block of ice upon his cart, which he pushed along in front of him. He shaved a portion of the ice into smithereens using a small wood planer that was inset with a sharp metal blade. He caught the crushed ice, patted it into a ball with his bare hands, stuck it on a small stick, and lifting a tall glass bottle with a narrow neck, poured the syrup over the ball of glistening ice. Of course, our mother had to try to make these herself, so Yasin was sent to find and buy a small wood planer, and then we had our own baraf ka golas till the novelty wore off. Yasin complained about the mysterious disappearance of teaspoons from the kitchen and couldn't understand why anyone would steal them. There was only Qayyum, whom he could suspect other than us children, but there was no way he could prove his suspicions. Besides, he couldn't imagine why we would take them and not use them in our games or creative ventures. He also knew that Qayyum always ate using his fingers rather than using cutlery, so he would have had no use for them. Then one day, as Yasin's back was turned away from the veranda, which adjoined the kitchen, he heard a faint sound, and turning saw a large crow, its black feathers glistening iridescently. Its yellow eyes boldly looked at him before it quickly flew off, holding a teaspoon in its beak. This was the beginning of the battle between Yasin and the crows. He eventually came up with the ingenious idea of setting up something similar to a balchatri. He took a piece of fresh meat that had a bit of fat on it and placed it on a small piece of wood. Laying this on the floor of the veranda, he propped up a heavy bamboo basket over it in such a way that the slightest would drop the basket, trapping whatever it was that attempted to get any object under it. To make it more tempting, he placed several teaspoons under the basket as well. There were many crows in the area, stealing eggs of other birds and picking off rodents and other small creatures that thrived in the Bay Area. Yasin didn't have to wait long before he heard a crow cawing and flapping its wings in distress, trying to release itself from the trap. Deftly, with expertise gained from slaughtering chickens, he reached under the basket and grabbed the crow, broke its neck with a quick twist of his wrists, and killed the bird. Its head hung limply from its body as he carried it into the kitchen, where he got a piece of jute string and, tying its feet together, hung it up and out on a pole extended over the veranda, a warning to other crows. As he stepped out of the kitchen door toward the veranda, he noticed that a large number of crows had ascended onto the roof of the opposite building, and a couple had perched on the parapet at the far end of the balcony, observing him. He quickly hung the bird and returned to the kitchen, not quite sure how things would develop. For a few days afterwards, he could hear the raucous cawing of a murder of crows in the vicinity, but no more teaspoons disappeared. Human justice had prevailed. The life of a bird that had responded to no more than an inherent instinct had been extinguished. But as far as Yasin was concerned, the wicked had been executed as a deterrent, and no more crimes would be committed.